Hi, I'm Rachel, and this is my AM reading video for Friday, April 24th, 2026, going up on a Saturday, and once again filmed on a Saturday. My excuse this week is that yesterday I had to cover for a colleague at work, so, anyway. So, this is my final AM reading video for April, but I do think I'll be back in early May to do like an official reading wrap up because I'm still in the middle of a few things, but hopefully I can just, give you a quick little check-in with this. So I'm going to start as usual by talking about the short story I'm reading in a literary journal. I'm actually starting a brand new collection this week. This is Frankly Feminist, which is a collection of short stories that were published in Lilith magazine. Lilith magazine is a Jewish women's magazine, and they've published over 200 stories in their run, and I believe this is a collection of 44 of them. And the first story in this collection is The New World, which was translated from the Yiddish and is by Esther Singer Kreitman, who is actually the sister of the famous Jewish novelist and writer Isaac Bashevis Singer. Kreitman had a very different sort of upbringing. She was very aware of being a woman whose I guess contributions would not be as widely considered in the broader world. And this story is the very first that deals with, sexism in life because it is from the perspective of a newborn baby. And basically from the off, when this baby is born, there's a little bit of disappointment and sort of a lack of fawning care because she's a girl child rather than a boy child. And so there's a few references to Shabbat and other Jewish ritual stuff just to, ground this in her lived experience. And then ultimately, her mother is so disappointed or just can't get up the milk to feed this newborn that she has to be taken to a midwife, which takes a while to find. And I think the midwife she does find is someone who has multiple children as it is. And meanwhile, this newborn's mother can't even care for her, which, the vantage point here really is from the perspective of the baby and the type of world she finds around her, which is a little less than welcoming. So I thought it was a relatively clever way to look at these issues. Next, I finished The Director by Daniel Kehlmann. I actually finished it on audio, and I got this book from the library. I think one of the last days I was listening to it, what do you know? But now I have a physical copy, which would also help me when I ultimately sit down to write my Goodreads review. But anyway, my preliminary thoughts for finishing the novel, which I talked about last week with my Synagogue Sisterhood book club. This is a novel that's on the shortlist for the International Man Booker. It is about a actual real-life director, movie director, G.W. Pabst. He was an Austrian director who found himself living in Austria during the war and unable to get out, and he was hounded by the Nazis basically to create art under their auspices, which he was hoping would just be, very unpolitical, and he'd have no dealings with anything having to do with the war. But of course, as time goes on, he is more and more complicit in using the war for his own ends, including using concentration camp prisoners as extras in a couple of his movies. One of them, I believe, is a real-life case where he wasn't actually the main director and wasn't even aware until later that these extras were concentration camp survivors. And then the other case, which is fictionalized, is when he actually decides to use the prisoners himself for another movie. So this is a story about culpability. I still think it kind of head-hopped a little too much for my taste. It took a little while to get into. There was kind of a fascinating opening, which took place a couple decades later and was in the headspace of his assistant director, who at the time was a man suffering from dementia at a sanatorium. And he was called in for a interview with a Austrian TV host at the time, trying to talk about Pabst. And this man, you could tell he was very confused and a bit belligerent, which, could have something to do with the dementia or could have to do with just a lot of the anxieties or what was going on, during the reign of the Nazis. I thought it was a fascinating look at how dementia impacts the mind, and we also come back to him at the end of the story, but it was a weird way to get into the headspace. And you know, we start with Pabst and his family in Hollywood, where he's not happily acclimating to the American scene, and that's part of the reason he decides to go back. But it feels like it didn't quite, I don't know, to me, get its center until he got back to Austria. And even then, it wasn't like the most, I guess, maybe it's okay that it wasn't like a really easy through line, because that's not how, I guess, culpability often works, and at least when you're sort of slowly being edged into it. And it just tried to like lean into the perspective of what was happening from various different people at various different times, like his wife and son and other people around him. But, you know, in terms of like a plottiness, I guess the most important part of the plot, which did come along even in, you know, the first chapter in, you know, the, you know, 60s or 70s or whatever, that was about his Lost movie, which was the one that he fictionally filmed with concentration camp survivors, and was lost on a train, allegedly, when he was going, I think, to Vienna to, you know, first he had, well, he cut the film, and then he had to, you know, I guess, release the film, and that's where he lost it. And it's, I guess, supposed to be this metaphor for, like, this lost brilliance, but it was the final, or not the, well, maybe the final film, or at least the final film of the story that was, he made under the Nazis. And then we go a little bit past the Nazis, and we talk about the impact that his career had on his family. Like, for example, his son joined Hitler Youth and ultimately joined the war and had an injury. And his wife basically was, she just was carted around, and, you know, didn't have much of a life of her own, and basically always had to just hold her tongue, because it was very dangerous, obviously, to express any dissent in a fascist system. And just ultimately, her own career and her own desires were just completely flatlined. So, you know, yeah, it's an interesting story, and I thought it, you know, it's the sort of thing, I think, in my book club that generates more positive thinking, because of the ways that it does intersect more directly with public history. Because sometimes we read novels that are much more about interiority, and maybe sometimes with younger authors, especially, about ideas that are a little less popular with an older reading audience. But this one, I think, landed more for them, and maybe a little less for me, actually. But overall, I thought, you know, some of the writing really was very arresting, like the way that the author got into Pabst's headspaces and the headspace of his assistant director as they were directing these concentration camp survivors. It was a really, you know, uncomfortable, but also just very, I feel, real to sort of the dissonance that they must have felt in their own heads. And I also did listen to it, as I said, on audio, and I thought that the acting, as it were, of the audiobook narrator really elevated the story as well. Next, I read Requiem and Other Poems by Aharon Shabtai, and I actually made a separate video just for this, because it was National Poetry Month, so I'll link to that down below. You know, I feel like I just sort of skimmed through it, and I tried to take a few poems from each of the 3 sections to highlight what Shabtai was trying to get to and talk about in his collection. Maybe to give a little more of a, you know, personal reaction. I don't think this was my favorite collection of poetry that I've read. Granted, I don't read a lot of poetry, and in fact, I use National Poetry Month to, you know, push myself into more of it. But yeah, this one, you know, the stanzas were so short and choppy. I just, you know, I didn't feel like it gave me usually enough to crack on, although that's not always true. Or maybe it's that the longer poems with the longer stanzas were the ones where he was dealing with October 7th and the aftermath, and taking the Israel society, and especially the state, to account when it comes to the war and to treatment of the Palestinians. And I thought those poems really landed the most for me, and maybe that's also just the bias, because, you know, that's where my headspace is as well. Whereas the other 2 sections, one was Requiem, the titular poem, which was a very long poem with over 100 stanzas, I believe. And it was sort of like a fever dream of this older poet remembering these snippets of neighbors from his childhood in Tel Aviv, which was in the Mandate of Palestine era. And you know, like the imagery could kind of come and go for me on that one. And then finally, his final section is about confronting death. And that one maybe worked the least well for me, as he talked to himself in third person, I should say, and debated if he should just lay down the pen and, you know, give up. But sometimes he also talked about his legacy with his poems, which I found more moving. But in general, I feel like there was maybe more of a genericness, I suppose, or maybe it's just my bias of not confronting that part of my life yet. It does, you know, I am hit by the fact that the poems that spoke the most to me are the ones that sort of align the most with where my own headspace is. So yeah, that was my experience with this collection. Next, I'm, well, kind of in the middle, maybe more at the beginning of What You Do to Me by Rochelle B. Weinstein. This is my Buzzwordathon / Raid the Shelves pick for April. This is a contemporary sort of upmarket women's book, I think. I'm using a lot of those random terms, I think. But it ostensibly is about this writer for the Rolling Stones, Cecilia James, in the 1990s, who stumbles across a woman who she believes was the influence for a major song. What You Do to Me is the fictionalized name of the song. It is actually based on a real song called Hey There Delilah, and I'll just link to a music video down below. Hopefully I can find one. I have it going in my head, which is cool. You know, for someone who considers herself somewhat musical, you know, I don't usually relate to how music is talked about in books like this. Like, you know, every chapter starts with a music title, and I don't think I know most of those songs well enough, like, for them to get stuck in my head the same way. And, you know, it's supposed to be enthused. The love of music is enthused in this story. Cecilia James, in fact, she loves music. That's why she writes for the Rolling Stone. And What You Do to Me is actually the anthem she and her boyfriend, you know, called their personal anthem. But she and her boyfriend Pete are kind of on the rocks because Cecilia's been putting her career first for so long. And actually, they're about to board a cruise in Miami to go on a week's vacation. And she's like last minute, like doing some work stuff and going on site for an interview or something. She leaves her camera somewhere. Suddenly her schedule is completely upended. She thinks she gets to the dock on time for the cruise, but in fact it's when the cruise ship is leaving, not the hour before when everyone was supposed to be boarded. So as she's watching the cruise ship leave, her boyfriend calls and says, you know, this was the last straw. You're obviously not invested in our relationship. I'm going to have to call it off. So that's what she's dealing with. But at the same time, she gets this, you know, lead stuck in her lap that maybe she can find the provenance of this song, What You Do to Me, and why the main singer wrote it. And so in flashback interstitial chapters, or well, not exactly interstitial, but flashback chapters in the 70s, we come across Sarah Feldman, who is the Jewish girl who is the inspiration for the song. At this point, Cecilia doesn't know who she is yet. She's still trying to track her down and is throwing herself into this work and feeling bad for herself for ruining this relationship, which I assume, though, given this is women's upmarket fiction, she might be able to repair the relationship in the end. Hopefully so, I suppose. Although, you know, generally speaking, this is, you know, once again, I keep picking up this sort of contemporary women's upmarket fiction, and it's usually just not for me. It's just, I don't know, it just skims the surface too much. So much of the beginning of this was told completely in exposition, like that was our way to get to know Cecilia and what she's going through. You know, and, you know, sort of exposition-y backstory, not just throwing us in with her and characters immediately. Actually, the first, I think, chapter, like, talk about framing devices, I think is much more modern day, like in the 2020s, where Cecilia's a middle-aged woman and she's, I guess, maybe accepting an award and looking back on this story. And, you know, that's the sort of thing where I feel like that's just, you know, way too much window dressing. Let's just get into the real story. We don't have to go into the 2020s. The real story is obviously her uncovering this past history. And we already, 2 timelines are enough, you know? We got her and then we got Sarah. So anyway, maybe my opinion about this book will change as I get further into it, but we shall see. And the final book I'm going to talk about is Not My Type, One Woman versus a President by E. Jean Carroll. And this is the memoir by E. Jean Carroll, one of President Trump's victims, alleged victim who accused him of sexual assault. And even though, her case didn't perhaps land him in jail or anything like that, she's still here to tell her story. And I am reading it for the BookTube Prize. So the BookTube Prize was started by Robert Sheard back in 2019 as a way for the literary bookternet to come together and judge the best of literary fiction and nonfiction published in the US in English the year before. So we are this year judging 2025 releases. I've been an official judge since 2020, and it's just been a wonderful way for me to connect with the community in new ways. Anyway, we do start with lists of 48 books per long list. Then through 4 rounds, we whittle them down until we get to one winner and some runners-up. We are in the second of the 4 rounds right now, the quarterfinals, and I am judging in nonfiction Group A, which means I pit this book against 5 others to decide which 3 I want to advance to the semifinals. But until we've reached the semifinals, I zip my lips so that I don't influence any other judges. But I did make a video where I talked about my preliminary thoughts about my ballot, so if you're interested in that, I'll link to that video down below, as well as the link to the BookTube Prize homepage if you want more general information. So that about covers it for me now. I feel like I have a long, busy day ahead of me. One of the major events of today in the US is that it is officially Indie Bookstore Day, where I think a few thousand indie bookstores are taking part in sales and selling special merchandise and what have you to encourage the community to come in. So I get very excited about this. So I'm hoping to go to that, and it'll be a big part of my book haul for April. And speaking of which, I guess my book haul hopefully should be my next video up on this channel. So stay tuned for that. I hope all of you who are going to Indie Bookstore Day have fun, and whatever you're doing this weekend, maybe catching up on some reading, which also would be great for me. I hope it works out well for you. Thanks so much for watching, everyone, and I'll see you next time.